Chapter 10. Monday, 7 p.m. End of the road. Larry's voice called me as though he were yelling against a strong wind. My head rested against something hard. I thought about it, decided it was the passenger window, and looked out. The lightning storm in the west was building. Then I realized I wasn't in the front seat, and Larry wasn't driving me into a new life. That new life had run out of time. Not that it had been much of a life. At least the insomnia and hallucinations hadn't been all that bad. I wondered if Dr. Jensen ever knew that he and Dr. Wiebel agreed on the part about my end being terrible. I doubted it. Shortly after I left his care, Dr. Jensen retired, formed a foundation, and became a full-time service dog shocker. Social media gave him a lot of attention for his major contribution to dog training. The Jensen Focus method requires that the puppy wears a collar, the owner wears a bracelet, and the trainer controls both. I like to think I helped him come up with the idea. Opinions on Jensen's method were strong and varied. Some opposed to the bracelet, others opposed to the collar. Then there were those opposed to both the collar and the bracelet. But my favorite was the guy who said the owner should wear the bracelet, Dr. Jensen the collar, and the puppy should be allowed to play with the controller. Dr. Wiebel, though well known in his field, was not the celebrity type. According to social media, he was doing research and recouping from pandemic-induced stress. His emails took a torturous route, effectively protecting his location from celebrity-level hackers. I was tracking his location, email by email. What reduces stress when money is unlimited? In his case, it was doing his research where life was cheap. I shrugged. For me, he was no longer a problem, nor was I going into his win column. I ignored Larry's eyes in the rearview mirror to check the reflections in the backseat windows. Gabriella was not coming along for my last ride. Relieved, I straightened and lifted my head. Riley twisted around to face me, her arms bent over the top of her seat, her brow furrowed in concern, her lips thinned in suspicion. I straightened, and after a moment, she slid back into her seat to face forward. Larry kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror. No one spoke. I looked down at my hands and grunted in surprise. They laid restfully on my lap. It was over. It was time, and I owed a lot to Larry. I suppressed a smile. Back in St. Louis, Detective Dayana was laying the DNA trail linking me to murder. Remembering the anger that emanated from the man, I knew he would put everything into it, even knowing that getting me away from Witsec was almost impossible. And, after I paid the debt I owed Larry, Dayana would never get me. I hoped he would get the guy he really wanted someday, the guy who murdered an innocent teenage girl. Riley slipped back into Gabriella's favorite position slowly and thoughtfully. She lowered her head and took deep breaths before looking at me, her expression cold, hard, and sad. Larry said, "Don't do it." "I don't have a choice. Decisions were made. They say this has gone on too long," Riley replied. "Don't do it. Please, or at least wait," Larry said, his voice almost pleading. Riley faced me and said, "I have to. Look at him. He knows." Since they were talking about me, I butted in. "She's right, Larry. It's time. Go ahead, Deputy." She started to speak and stopped. Looking at me apologetically, she lifted her purse from the floor and fumbled inside. Larry groaned. "Really? When did we become cops?" Without looking up, she mumbled, "Ever hear of Homeland Security?" Wondering why I waited so long, I shifted so I didn't have to face Larry's pleading eyes in the rearview mirror. It was time to pay him back and let him off the hook. Riley opened a pocket notebook before switching on a small voice recorder. Even the younger marshals are old school. She hesitated, and then, without looking at Larry or me, spoke into it to memorialize who was in the car, the time, the date, the highway, and even the mile marker. She flipped a page in her notebook, looked at me, and began recording the end of my life. Paul. We might as well use your real name. We know that Ernest Dragna, Frank Nicky, you, and your wife were all in the same restaurant on 8th Avenue, April 10th, 2020, between 8:30 and 10 p.m. We have the restaurant's video. You and your wife left for a theater on 7th Avenue a little before 10. We found tickets in your pocket for the 10:45 show. Craig Nicky left the restaurant right before you did. 10 minutes later, people heard shots fired. You were found in a parking lot across from the theater. We think you were cutting across it. And we have you positively identifying him as the man who shot you and your wife." She paused to let it sink in. After a moment, I nodded. I knew what was coming and just wanted it over. "What we don't have, Paul, Mr. Harding, is the reason why he would kill your wife and leave you for dead. Why would Mr. Dragna send Mr. Nicky after you? Without that, all we have is your testimony against Mr. Nicky. Mr. Harding, I promise you will get full immunity if you just tell us the truth." I felt the scar on my face tighten, took a deep breath, and snarled. "Full immunity?" She took it wrong. "Yes, full immunity. You just have to tell us the truth. Mr. Harding, we think Mr. Nicky killed your wife and tried to kill you. Tell us why, and we can put these guys where they belong. Fuck your immunity." She jerked her head back as if slapped, and her eyes narrowed to slits barely discernible under dark lashes. Larry kept his eyes on the road, but his shoulders flexed as he struggled to contain himself. Knowing him, he could be trying to hold in his anger, amusement, or both. "Fine, forget it. What was the deal between Dragna and you?" Riley snapped, her eyes probing, voice vexed, and the knuckles on her hand white as she tried to strangle an innocent recording device. I didn't try to contain myself and barked at her. "You know what it was. You just want me to make it official. Larry, watch the damn road." Larry's eyes, hurt and resentful, returned to the road. I started my confession. Maybe I didn't know what I did for Dragna, but I had made an effort to learn what I probably did for the son of a bitch, and what, in the end, got Gabriella killed. I told the darkness to wait a little longer. Our war was over. I took a long breath and confessed. "You know Dragna launders money for the mob, gangs, whatever the fuck you want to call them, using his venture capital business. I don't know how long you've known about him, but you can't figure out how to get him. I doubt you even know which business he got into first, venture capital or money laundering. Who cares? And is there even a difference? Given how long it took you guys to even know he was a player, my guess is that he started as a venture capitalist. Wasn't that big of a leap for him. How am I doing?" It didn't matter if it was true. All that mattered was they needed something to hang on Dragna. And with luck, Nicky. Riley barely nodded as if afraid of interrupting me. Amused, I smiled at her, and she flinched at the sneer. It stung, of course, but I shook it off. It didn't matter any longer, and it wasn't important. Neither she nor the people pulling her strings knew how Dragna got started. I just needed them to understand that I knew more about Dragna than they did, which was sadly true. I decided against telling her how much more she didn't know, since it might confuse things. In my past life, I worked with Homeland Security types from all branches. They tend to be linear thinkers. When combined with exhaustive processes, it works well enough. Or it does until they run up against people like Dragna, which is why they need WITSEC. Now, out of time, I needed to concentrate on the parts they'd readily accept and hopefully act upon. "Okay, so we're on the same page. You can't catch Dragna because first, he's smarter than you," I said sadly, hearing the twinge of disgust in my voice. "And second, he has or had me to help him," I added. Larry looked over his shoulder and gave me a hard look. I raised an eyebrow. "All good things come to an end, brother. You don't even have enough on him to get warrants to tap his phone, emails, texts, or anything that matters. But that's no problem because the NSA is always willing to help out. Riley, I'm not guessing. I know," I said as Riley started to speak. Not giving a damn, I smiled my sneer, and she kept her face neutral. After all, she was getting the confession of her career. But no one, not even a guy like Dragna, is smart enough to always be one step ahead. All you need is for him to slip, just once, and it's game over for him. All serious players use hackers to keep ahead of you. The worst part is that they do pretty well. But it's getting tougher. More and more of the time, hackers become your targets. Usually you catch them because they stumble into honey traps. And I built the best honey traps in the world. Larry, his voice hard and cold, said, "Yeah, Paul, that's pretty much what everyone thinks. And I'm sure some folks, not as smart as you or Dragna, will want to sit down with you geniuses and talk about how you pulled it off. But I have a question." "Shoot." Trust me, brother, right at this minute I'd like nothing more. Why did he send Nikki after you that night? What happened in the restaurant? You and Gabriella have a sit-down with Dragna that went south? It was a cheap shot, and rage swept through me. I slipped my arm out of the seatbelt shoulder strap and lunged forward. When Riley put out a hand, I smacked it away. Larry didn't flinch or take his hands off the steering wheel. Fuck you, Larry. Gabriella never knew anything about any of this. Yeah, right. What's the point of protecting her, Paul? She's dead. If she wasn't in on it, why'd he shoot her? Nikki is ex-Special Forces. He wouldn't take both of you out like that unless necessary. Man up. What did you and Gabriella tell Dragna at the restaurant? He leaned forward over the steering wheel. My seatbelt gouged into my waist as my fingers clawed angrily at his back, trying to get enough of his shirt to pull him back to me. I slammed back into my seat and fumbled with the seatbelt latch, too angry to let my hands cooperate. Pull over, Larry, Riley ordered. Fuck that. He moves, just shoot the bastard. Go on, Paul. Tell us what you and your little wife said that made a guy like Dragna take both of you off the board. Go on, damn it. Just remember, her family in France has waited a long time. The message finally worked through layers of rage, grief, and guilt. I rejected it, except for the part about her family. I gave up on the seatbelt. Larry kept us at cruising speed, and I kept my mouth shut, wondering how I'd missed the obvious. I worked through it and decided it didn't change a thing. Her family would have my confession, regardless of what Dragna or Nikki said, and it needed to end with Dragna and Nikki getting what they deserved. You're right, Larry. I saw Dragna and Nikki sitting at a table. I told Gabriella I'd seen a client I was having trouble getting a hold of and went over to sit with them. I told them I wanted a bigger cut or I was out. I had been careful, very careful. We both knew he couldn't keep going without me. I told him how all of the breadcrumbs supported my version, of how I lured him into not just one, but a series of traps, each adding a little more evidence. And the best part? The best part was that it was true. I had him where I wanted him. I owned the bastard. Larry snorted. You owned Dragna? Riley's head snapped back to Larry, and she said, Shut up, let the man talk. Ignoring her, he glanced over his shoulder at me and raised an eyebrow. Then his eyes went back to watching the road. I spoke to the back of Larry's head. Yeah, cowboy, it's a new world. Information rules. He didn't like it, but he agreed to my terms. I went back to my table. Larry gave me the finger. Riley snapped an angry look at him before nicely asking, So, what happened? What made him change his mind? Relief flooded through me. It was over. I have no fucking idea. I never worried about Dragna doing anything but paying up. Who knows, maybe he was ready to retire. Or maybe I wasn't as indispensable as I thought. You can ask him. Your little recorder get all of that? Good. Know what? I'm glad it's finally over. And I was. The realization soaked in with a beautiful emptiness, as if I were suspended in time and space. I leaned back, squeezed my eyes shut, opened my passenger door, and fell out. I opened my eyes, hoping it had gone so fast I missed it. But instead of a white light pulling me into eternity and releasing me from the shreds of a life that had ended years ago, I looked down at a blur of pavement inches from my face. I'd forgotten to unbuckle the damn seatbelt. The edge of the door slammed into my chest, pinning me with the force of Larry's 90-mile-an-hour cruising speed wind, the pavement rushing under me. I pushed back with both hands to relieve the pressure. Trembling with the exertion, I used my right hand to keep the door open, while struggling with my left to unclip the seatbelt. Then my right hand slipped, and the door slammed back against me. My body arched in pain, forcing my legs under the front seat. Screaming in pain and rage, I tried to wrench it sideways. Even over the roar of the pavement, I heard my back muscles popping. Suddenly, my right leg was free. I swung it upwards, the lap belt biting into my waist. I'm over 6 feet tall. The pavement was less than a foot away. For endless peace, I needed only to make it that far. I gagged on hot splatters of road dust, and grit shot into my eyes. Closing them and clenching my jaw, I pulled myself slowly downward. For some reason, the pressure on the door eased, and again I pushed it off me. I gave up on the belt release, and, needing only inches, I tried to force my waist under the lap belt with my left hand. I felt myself slip, but my left foot remained stuck under the front seat. I was frantically starting to bend my right leg to kick myself free when it was violently pinned downward. Pain shot through my back as I twisted, flinging my right leg upward. My left remained under the front seat. Before I could try again to free it, my right leg was forced back down past the back seat to the floorboards, wrenching my hip socket. Again, I screamed, this time more in anger than pain. I somehow brought my right foot up and felt it strike something. My left foot began to slip free from under the seat, and I tried to buck free with all of my body. The effort brought me upward, away from the pavement that promised release from all pain. A weight came down on both legs, pushing them back to the floor. Desperately, I slashed my body back and forth sideways. My right leg shot free and slammed upward, hitting the roof. My head swung down, and my face was inches from the gray blur of the highway. Then the concrete vanished, and pieces of gravel shot into the side of my head. I frantically tried to blink the sand that ground under my eyelids. The SUV bounced hard. Once again, I lost my grip on the door, but this time because it bounced open. Finally, the lap belt painfully yielded me the few inches I needed. I twisted, throwing my hands in the air and my head backward to the ground. 1,000 sharp edges pulled at my hair. Then my head jerked up involuntarily as something slammed into my stomach. I ripped apart the two slender arms that reached out to pull me upward. The back of my head slapped hard onto the gravel as dust swirled into my mouth. We had come to a stop. I and the darkness had both lost. I don't know how long I laid half in and half out of the vehicle, blinded by the sand and dirt of every passing car. Riley crawled over me and knelt on the hard gravel next to me. I heard her gasping for air between the shock waves from passing semis. Larry knelt by her before standing over me. "I should toss your ass onto the highway," he growled. He reached into the car and with one hand unbuckled the seatbelt I had fought so hard. Then he pulled me roughly to my feet. When Riley stood, I saw that her face was scraped and bruised. Each of her arms had red marks that were already turning purple. Shame cut through my numbness. I had never hurt a woman in my life until the very end. She exchanged a glance with Larry and without a word went to the back of the SUV. She returned with a canvas bag and removed handcuffs and leg irons. Marshals are, at their core, manhunters and travel with the tools of their trade. Before chaining me, Larry clumsily sponged off the road grit from my face using a bottle of water and the remains of my shirt. He then bandaged the worst scrapes, including one on my shoulder that required picking out gravel using the forceps from the first aid kit. Occasionally, he glanced at Riley's bruised face before jabbing the tips of the forceps hard into my raw flesh with no apologies. When he finished, Riley fished out one of my shirts from my duffel, and they helped me raise my arms to get it on. Before the highway patrol arrived, Larry helped me back into the car and, almost apologetically, handcuffed me. Dejected, I slumped forward. Riley stood outside my open passenger door with one hand resting lightly on my back, her face turned away from me. When the state patrol car turned off its lights, made a U-turn and drove back east, it was dark. Riley headed for the bushes before the state patrol car finished its U-turn. Larry waited until the taillights faded in the east before coming around and removing my leg irons. He kept my hands cuffed in front of me and my waist chained to the seat. Knowing how the night carries sound, he spoke in a low voice. "Jesus, Paul, I had no idea you were at this stage." As he gently shut the door, I replied, "You can't tell them, Larry. Nikki needs to pay for Gabriella." I looked over to see Riley almost at her door. When I turned back, Larry's face was inches from mine. "Tell you what, brother, we'll get you cleaned up at the next rest stop and talk things over. Then let's see what happens," he whispered as Riley's door opened. With instinctive kindness, Larry opened the sunroof, and I slumped back, staring at the prairie's bright night sky. There didn't seem to be enough room for all of the stars. Growing up, I took a night sky filled with the Milky Way for granted. It wasn't quite the Wyoming sky of my boyhood, but it was close. Larry kept his eyes on the road. Riley sat in the back seat next to me, leaned against her door, rubbed her jaw, and stared out into the darkness. She held a collapsible steel baton in her right hand, and occasionally glanced at me as if considering how to best put it to use. I couldn't help but wonder how a seatbelt Larry unbuckled with one hand had kept me alive long enough for Riley to dive on top of me. It had all made sense an hour ago. All I had to live for was a lotto game jackpot chance at getting Nicky myself. The chance of a federal prosecutor like Gibaldi putting me on the stand was almost zero. But I had decided that the ambitious coward might just use a full confession recorded at the end of life. It might be challenged, but never cross-examined. And best of all, my brain would have been roadkill that Weeble would never have a chance to sample. It had all seemed crystal clear and straightforward. And yet, I failed. Or had I? Now the confession was out there. Would the feds investigate and find what had always been hiding in plain sight? Or would Gibaldi take the easy way out and use it to put me away? Would spending my final days in prison be a living hell? Or would I even know where I was? I had a number I could call. Since the chances were pretty good that Weeble was going to get his pound of brain from me anyway, why not take him up on his offer? I closed my eyes as despair washed over me.